The birthday party was underway when Harper stepped out of his limo at the front door of the small mansion. He strutted to the double wood door with the gold hardware, checking every few minutes for the large diamond ring he bought Elizabeth. He checked one more time in his breast pocket. When the door opened for Harper and he entered the foyer, Emily was walking out of Elizabeth's room and down the stairs in her black and white uniform. Her eyes turned to Harper and they locked eyes. Her greens to his blues and his breath hitched. Emily stopped. She couldn't move. Harper's eyes, compelling with a burning faraway look, held her and wouldn't release her. He didn't move and she didn't move. They stood watching at each other. Emily couldn't disguise her heartbeat, and Harper couldn't deny he heard it hammering in her chest. Or the flood of arousal coursing through him, and the heated flash of passion and desire changing the color of his eyes from blue to gold. Behind Emily strode Elizabeth, who saw the exchange. She waved at Harper before bounding down the stairs, then meeting him halfway as he passed Emily. Elizabeth took Harper's hands and pulled him up the stairs, passing Emily with a cold glance and into her room. She whispered, "I have something for you." This drew a smile from Harper. "Where are your parents?" "Don't worry about them. I'm going to be a married woman soon." She glanced up at Harper with innocent wide eyes. "That is, if you're planning to ask me to marry you." "It's what I dreamed of since I met you." He placed his hand to his breast pocket and the ring was there. He pulled it out. Elizabeth's eyes sparkled. "I want to give it to you in front of your parents." He closed the box and tucked it back into his pocket. Smiling at Harper with pleasure and excitement, overcome by the size of her engagement ring, she unzipped his pants, and before he could open his mouth, she was on her knees and she had his penis in her hand and she was looking up at him. This time she wouldn't tease him by giving him a hand job, it would be the real thing. She saw how he was looking at Emily, and she thought she had let enough time pass where he would do anything to get into her pants. That was her plan, to ensnare him and get him to marry her. And she had been right. But Harper was in love, and it wouldn't have taken much to get him to ask her to be his bride. That was before he laid eyes on Emily. When he passed Emily, he didn't know what came over him. Never had he been this attracted to anyone like this before. He could smell her, he could hear her heartbeat, and he became overcome with impatient desire to have her. He stared wordlessly at her. Sudden shock and warmth surged through him. Her jade eyes captured him and made him breathless. He felt a desire to mate with her. Did his mind say mate? Elizabeth wrapped her lips around the head of his penis and pushed it into her mouth. And the surprise jarred him back to Elizabeth. "What are you doing?" It felt good, but he had imagined Elizabeth differently than any of the other girls. He didn't feel comfortable with her satisfying him in this manner. Not the future mother of his children, he thought. He reached and pulled his penis from her mouth and brought her to her feet. "What's wrong, Harper? I thought this is what you wanted." "I thought so too until..." "Not until we're married," he said, but it wasn't what Harper thought. He had second thoughts after seeing Emily. "Well, I'll save that for our wedding night," Elizabeth said, using her finger to wipe her lips. "Go. I'll meet you downstairs." He zipped up his pants and he turned and she pushed him out of her room. "Go." He smiled at her and walked through the door and trotted down the stairs and met Emily passing with a tray holding champagne. Stopping her, he said, "Do you work here?" "No. I just break into strange parties, put on a maid's uniform, and carry around a tray hoping you will pass and take a glass of champagne from my tray," Emily said to Harper with a straight face. His eyes brightened, his dark eyebrows arched mischievously, and he smiled. He was the most beautiful man she had seen. She couldn't take her eyes off him. Tall dark hair accentuated with wide blue eyes. His face rugged and handsome with a square jaw and two dimples on the side which cut deep when he smiles. When he slanted his head, she saw his profile, dark against the lights of the large chandelier overhead. His face smooth and sensitive. He thought the same of her. Beautiful, he thought. What is it about her that made him want to hold her and kiss her? What was happening to him? He never had eyes for anyone but Elizabeth, until now. But then he thought about the ring burning a hole near his heart, as if it had a life. He began to sweat. Is something wrong, Mr. Samsa? You know my name? Yes. You're Elizabeth's fiancé. Not yet. But I will be, Harper said, not too enthusiastic about it. They were looking so deeply into each other's eyes that they didn't see Elizabeth walk down the stairs and touch Harper on the shoulder and raise an eyebrow to Emily. You haven't gotten far, Elizabeth said, kissing Harper on the cheek while cutting her eyes to Emily. I find you standing on the stairs talking to my maid. She turned to Emily with a short closed smile. Emily, that will be all. Tucking her arms under Harper, she said, There's my mother and father. You can break the news to them. Emily scurried away into a crowd of guests in the next room, amid the chattering of voices and clanging of champagne glasses. Her job was important, and she didn't want Elizabeth to get the wrong impression. But under any other circumstances, she would have done anything to catch this man's eye. However, she thought she wasn't qualified to have a man like him. What obviously rich young man from a good family would find her appealing? Emily's background was nothing to speak of. She hadn't come from money. Her father was a drunk. He came to San Francisco after a stint in the army to get into the technology field, but he had such a drinking problem he couldn't get a job. He met her mother where she became pregnant without knowing anything about him. They fell in love, her father had said. After Emily had been born, Emily's mother took off a year later for Seattle, leaving her with her father. Emily never heard from her mother again. She and her father moved around every 6 months for non-payment of rent. Her days and nights were filled with trying to make it through school and now college. She thought if she could get a good-paying job, or at least a job to keep her from having to move from one vermin-infested motel to another, she could have a life. This job as a maid with room and board was all that interested her now. Except for Harper Samsa, a man she could never have, so she put him out of her mind. Her job here would afford her the opportunity to graduate and get her a position as a teacher at the local school. Teaching is a respectable job, she was told by the recruiter when she asked about the pay. Not a job that pays a lot of money, but a job that has its rewards. With the sky-high rent in San Francisco, it was impossible to make it on a teacher's salary in San Francisco. She would have to move out of California. Maybe go to Arizona or Nevada, she thought. It was cheaper to live there. Chapter 5. Daddy, Harper would like to ask you a question, Elizabeth said in a frail, soft, childish voice. Can't Harper speak for himself? Oh, Daddy, of course he can. Harper stood near Elizabeth's father when a strange feeling came over him. He took a deep breath. His heart raced as if it was going to jump from his chest. He put his hand quickly to his chest to feel the beat. Never had he had anything like this to happen to him before. Sweat broke and beaded on his brow. What's wrong with you, Harper? Elizabeth said. Is he on drugs? Elizabeth's father asked. He's not on drugs, Daddy. Her father glanced at him skeptically. I thought you were different, Harper. Harper couldn't catch his breath. He couldn't speak and the sweat came in waves after wiping his brow several times. He's not on drugs, Elizabeth insisted as Harper held his chest, his eyes blinking and perspiration emptying down his face. His body felt as if it had stepped into an oven. I need a few minutes, Harper said, holding his chest and panting with his mouth open. His eyes narrowed and he turned to see the terrace door. He dashed to the door, but with the crowded room, he took a few minutes. He needed air and he couldn't get it, so he pushed two couples standing in his way aside and rushed through the doors. When he glanced up, he saw the full moon. He stood underneath it, and his first thought when he opened his mouth was to howl. Still in control of his body, he held back his instincts. What is happening to me? He murmured. His mouth opens and gasping for breath. Then he heard voices inside the room where he left Elizabeth. It was Elizabeth and her father. Did you at least get him to give you that ring? Not yet, but if you didn't try to be condescending and let him talk, he was about to ask me to marry him. You have no one to blame but yourself. Once I marry him, I can get you out of debt and I can divorce him and marry who I want. You're not going to marry that fool, what's his name? He doesn't have a dime. I'll get enough from Harper where I can marry whomever I want, and you're not going to stop me, Daddy. Now shut up, Harper's looking at us. They stopped talking, but it was too late. Harper, although he thought he was in love, wasn't a fool, and it was best that he found out now than later. But it was the way he found out. How could he hear their conversations? When his body calmed, he took a deep breath. Now his body was telling him that he needed to have sex. He had stopped sweating and his breathing came under control. He raised his head and opened the doors to the room full of laughter and whispering. Even the whispers were too loud for him. He strolled back to Elizabeth and said, "Excuse me, but Elizabeth and I have unfinished business." "What's going on, Harper?" "You look different," Elizabeth said. "I am different." And he pulled her up the stairs to her room. "Now where were we when I said it wasn't appropriate for you to engage in sex with me?" His voice cold and hard. "I was unzipping your pants like this." And Elizabeth pulls the zipper down. She reached for his penis and she said in surprise, "I didn't know you were that large." Harper had to look down because he didn't believe it himself. "It's a mouthful, but I think I can handle it." And she went to her knees, and before she could put his penis in her mouth, he pulled away. "I don't think I want you anymore," he said. His voice cool. Elizabeth glared at him. "What about the engagement?" He reached into his coat and pulled out the large diamond and handed it to her. "I thought you were what I wanted in life, but I found out different. You thought I was a fool. I may have been, but I'm not your fool any longer. You were only using me. I'm no longer that man who met you in college and fell in love with you like so many other unsuspecting assholes." She put on the ring. "You don't know what you're saying. I want to make love to you." She walked close to Harper and he felt nothing. Not like before when the thought Elizabeth was all he needed. "For some reason I think you're not the woman for me," Harper said, turning away from her and walking out the room and closing the door behind him. He strolled down the stairs as if in a dream and had been given a reprieve from a death sentence. He wore a large smile. He felt free like an animal. Free from all that had made him a prisoner as a man. When he bounded down to the first floor, he heard the loud noise of people enjoying each other. And then he heard, "Are you all right, Mr. Samsa?" He turned to see Emily, and the feeling he witnesses before became uncontrollable. "I am now." But he wasn't all right. He knew something significant was happening to him, and he had no control over it. "I have to go," he said, and rushed to the door to get some air. When he stepped outside, his limo driver, seeing his raised hand, turned the car and drove up under the doorway to pick him up. "I need some air." "I'll walk," he said, panting. The fog had settled and blanketed San Francisco. "But it's 2 miles and up and down hill, sir," his driver said. "I know. I need the exercise," Harper insisted. He tapped the car and it took off. Harper had never seen San Francisco like this at night. He heard animals and birds and the waves from the ocean. He continued walking and then he stopped in his tracks. He looked up and howled to the moon. He didn't know why he did that. Maybe it was out of frustration. Maybe it was because he thought he would never have a family, or from the death of his father. Or maybe because he was free to do whatever he wanted. Harper had never mourned his father. He glances up at the beautiful vision of a full moon and said, "Father, you will never see this brilliant moon again." And he howled over and over from the pain of loss. Maybe he howled because he would never be able to marry and have children, because something had happened to him, which he didn't know how to explain. Then with the long walk home he had time to think, and he knew it had something to do with the animal bite by the wolf who had him baying at the moon. As he took another step, he heard sounds of bones breaking. It was coming from his body, and when he glanced at his hands they were changing, and the fine hair on his body became thick. 1 minute he was looking like a man, and the next he had become a creature standing like a man, thinking like a man, and then he stood on all fours and he was then a large white wolf. He howled as if crying. Then he wondered what he would do. How could he live like this? Harper dashed and hid behind some large bushes and lay curled up like a dog. He wasn't a dog, and he couldn't stay there forever. He looked down to see his clothes shredded and on the ground next to his black bow tie and phone. Harper stayed there huddling until he realized that he had to call someone. He had stayed curled up feeling sorry for himself. Then he realized that he had to confide in someone. So he called Michael. "I need you to pick me up and bring me some clothes." And Harper gave him the address. Michael didn't ask him why he didn't call his driver. He knew Harper had to have a serious problem for him to ask him to get out of his bed with his wife at 5 in the morning to drive across town to get him. When Michael reached the location Harper had given, he saw Michael's Jaguar stop, and he stepped from behind the garbage bins and quietly entered the car. "I'm not going to ask you if you are on drugs. The police would probably do that if someone saw you and reported this. If it happens again, they may get their chance, but I know you. I just want you to tell me what's going on, and should I be concerned, and are you likely to do this again?" Michael took his eyes off the road for a few seconds. "I've been asking myself this all night. I had time to think. I may have mentioned to you that a wolf bit me on my drive from Colorado to San Francisco. First of all, may I say that I warned you against that drive." He turned looking at Harper as Harper pulled up his pants. "You look different. I never knew your chest to be that wide, and your shoulders unbelievable, and your—" "Don't say it. There would be no reason for you to see my cock." "Even your language is coarse," Michael said. "And I saw your cock," he paused, "when you were a baby. It wasn't a cock then, it was a penis, and a very small one." "That's different," Harper snapped. "No, not really. You can tell a lot even that young, but there was nothing to give me indications that you would have, as you say, a cock the size of a—" "I know. I know. Do you want to know what happened, or do you want to discuss the size of my penis?" Harper said, blowing out his breath in frustration. This was a serious matter, and he didn't have time discussing his body parts or the hair over his body. "It would help if you explained what is wrong and how this physical change came about in you." As Harper was explaining to Michael how he was bitten by a wolf, Elizabeth was explaining why she had to dismiss Emily.